Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is my New York, the city that never sleeps. And because it doesn't, those of us who live here and those who rely on New York for their livelihood demand vigilance of our protectors, the police, the fire departments, EMS, and other agencies, 24/7. One of them is one you probably have never heard of. It's the city's unblinking eye, the Watch Command. Its director is Ben Krakauer. You will meet him next. I'm happy to welcome to the program Ben Krakauer, and glad to see you for a number of reasons, not least of which is the fact that you're here means there's probably nothing dire emergency-wise going on in the city.
Right, that's a good point. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Explain to our audience what the Watch Command is.
So Watch Command is the city's 24/7 operations center. So as you go across the country and really around the world, most jurisdictions have what they call an emergency operations center, where every level of government comes to coordinate a response to an emergency or disaster. In New York City, we never close our emergency operations center. It's always open, and it's always open with Watch Command.
Give us an idea of what Watch Command looks like. I mean, I have visions of something out of 2001 or some big room.
Sure. So it's an operations center. So there's a large video wall on the front screen where we're monitoring a number of our internal systems and also local, state, regional, international, and national media. We have tons of computers. All of our watch commanders and our public warning staff have 6 computers in front of them, looking at lots of different systems, really attempting to know all that is knowable about emergency activity in and around New York and anything that can impact New York or New Yorkers around the world.
And what brings in, among the things that bring in information into the Watch Command, would I be correct in assuming that you get CCTV feeds, for instance?
We do. We have some CCTV feeds. We also are listening to public safety radio frequencies. So we're listening to the police department, the fire department, a number of the other public agencies in the city. We're getting tons of emails. We process more than 50,000 inbound emails every month. We're seeing what people are saying on social media in and around New York City, what images they're posting, and we're also talking to our counterparts in other operation centers, state operation centers, utility companies, police, fire, EMS.
So would I be correct in assuming that if something of an emergency nature happens, a crane collapses, there's an explosion at a building, you guys know it first, or the police department and you guys know it at the same time, or?
So all the public safety agencies are monitoring these sources. Obviously the first people who are going to realize it is likely going to be a 911 operator, so the police department and the fire department, but we're going to learn about it within seconds thereafter.
What can you describe a typical 24 hours at the Watch Command?
I think the best way to describe a typical 24 hours is there's no typical 24 hours. New York City, there's always something going on, whether it's a local event, a parade, or a traffic accident that's causing, disruptions, or mass transit disruptions that we need to tell the public about, to building fires and vacates from buildings that are no longer safe for people to live in. So we really run the gamut across, all sectors, and from infrastructure to public safety, to public transportation.
And what do you do with the information when something of an emergency nature happens? I mean, obviously, as you're suggesting, police and fire may already know about it, but what is it that you guys are tasked to do?
So our job in emergency management is to be the city's coordinating agency. So what we do is we want to make sure that all the agencies are aware of these incidents, not necessarily just police and fire, but some of the other 40 or 50 agencies that serve New Yorkers every day. And we want to make sure that they're aware of it and that they're able to bring any resources that those agencies have to bring to bear to manage the emergency. So we share information with our agency partners. We also share information through the city's Notify NYC system with the general public. So people are able to go online or call 311 and register for what we call Notify NYC and find out about emergency activity and disruptive events in their home community.
One of the ways you notify people is something called the wireless emergency alerts, and I understand you had a lot to do with upgrading and streamlining that system. Tell us more about it. I mean, I think New Yorkers, or at least some, might relate to what I'm talking about. If you remember the bombing in Chelsea,
Sure.
And then shortly, some people's, perhaps many people's smartphones started buzzing, and
that was us.
That was you guys.
That was us.
How does this work? What's
Sure.
going on there?
So wireless emergency alerts are a federal program. It was authorized by Congress in 2006 in the WARN Act and became operational 6 years later in 2012. As a matter of fact, the first wireless emergency alerts in the country, back when it was in the testing phase, were sent out from New York City Emergency Management when we were supporting the FCC and FEMA with testing of the system. But what it is it's an opt-out program. So when you buy a cell phone, if you've bought a cell phone since 2012, it's already enabled to receive these wireless emergency alerts.
Automatic. It's in there.
It's in there automatically. And what we're able to do in really serious emergencies is push a message to all those phones off the cell phone towers. So we can hit one or two cell phone towers, or we can hit all the cell phone towers. It's very, very powerful technology that we use very sparingly because we're always concerned about warning fatigue. So we want people, when they get these messages, to pay very close attention to them, follow the instructions that we're giving, take the appropriate protective action. So since we got access to the technology in 2012, we've only used it 8 times. 3 of those times was in response to the Chelsea bombing.
And what were you telling people back then? What were these alerts saying?
So late Saturday night, the initial alert that we put out just to the Chelsea community was telling people in that area to stay away from windows, to really shelter in place. And that was when the secondary device was discovered on West 27th Street. And then when the NYPD bomb squad came in and cleared that device and put it in their containment unit and got it off the scene, we let people know that they could resume their normal lives and go back to their windows, and they didn't have to shelter anymore. That following Monday, the 19th, we put out a citywide message at the request of NYPD in an attempt to find the suspected bomber.
We're looking for so-and-so, and if you have any information,
call 911.
Call 911. What's been your experience with this? Are people, I imagine most people who buy a cell phone and have bought one since 2012 didn't know that this was built into their phone. And what's been your experience with people's reaction to this?
So the experience has been overall positive. People react to these messages. They certainly, we see people post them on social media and share them with their friends and talk about it. And it really is a dramatic feeling if you're walking down a sidewalk or you're in a cafe and everyone's phone goes off at the same time. I mean, that's really the true power of the system. You can get a targeted message out to millions of New Yorkers, or a smaller number if you want to target down to a city block or a neighborhood very, very quickly. But there are challenges with the system. Right now we're limited to 90 characters. We're limited to English-only messages. We are not able to include phone numbers or links. And that's one of the reasons that we've been working very closely for the last year with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, on advocating for needed changes to make that system even better.
Let's talk about another, not so recent, but not too far in the past, series of emergencies, I guess you could call them. There was the gas explosion in the East Village, killed a couple of people, wiped out a whole bunch of apartments and stores. It was found to be illegal tapping of the gas line, and we've had several of those. We had one up, I think, in Harlem. We had one on the west side. Is it the same for your agency? Something like that happens, you're in motion alerting people, or?
We are. So in all those incidents, we put out public messaging right away, letting people know what happened and what they should do. In most cases, the general advice, the first message is to avoid the area just because of the sheer number of emergency personnel that are responding. But the other part of emergency management, the other part of our agency, our counterparts in the operations division, are our field responders. So we have what we call citywide interagency coordinators that are sent out to major or complex emergencies in the city to do what we do in Watch Command on the ground with all the agencies that are responding. Make sure that the agencies have all the information they need, make sure any agencies that are not there are brought to the scene, look for the human services issues and coordinate the human services response, housing, feeding, mental health support. We want to make sure that New Yorkers are taken care of.
You talk about coordinating emergency efforts in a situation like this, and I wonder how complex or difficult that job might be, because I remember a time in this city when police and fire officers couldn't talk to each other. I mean, their radios were not on the same frequency, I guess. What kind, among the roadblocks to your job of coordinating is that one still, or tell us about others?
I mean, the city has made tremendous advances the last decade or so on what we call interoperability, which is the ability by radio for the other public safety agencies to talk to one another. So police and fire are able to talk to each other now on radios. On a scene, one of the things that we established early on is what we call a unified command post. So you're going to have an emergency management coordinator standing next to the fire chief, standing next to the supervisor from the police department, standing next to the environmental protection water supervisor, standing next to the Department of Health representative, the Department of Buildings. They're all going to be standing there and at a strategic level making decisions about how to respond to that incident. We also have improved interoperability across the river with New Jersey, with our counterparts in Suffolk, Nassau, and Westchester. So we are able to do radio communication, very, very effectively. And we want to make sure that we're able to communicate not just with the public safety agencies, but also with other critical facilities. And something that we've rolled out over the last 2 years, which was identified in the Sandy After Action report, was putting radios, we call 700 megahertz radios, in every nursing home and adult care facility in the city. Because what we discovered after Sandy is that after the storm tide came in and the power was out, you had nursing homes that were really islands to themselves. They weren't able to call for help for ambulances. They weren't able to get additional assistance for their patients. But the city's radio network is very, very robust, and we continue to build it out. So now 95% of nursing homes and adult care facilities have been equipped with what we call a 700 megahertz radio. And they're able to call right into Watch Command and get the services that they need in the event that all their other communication mechanisms fail.
Interesting you bring up Sandy. That I was thinking about it myself in terms of, I don't know, a greater emergency that the city has faced in recent years. And of course, what you direct, Watch Command, is part of the Office of Emergency Management of this city. Let's talk about Sandy a little bit and what you guys do and what OEM gets prepared to do when something like this is headed our way.
Sure. So we're very attuned to the weather. One of our core competencies in emergency management is to make sure that we monitor weather conditions and alert all of our agency partners whenever the city is going to experience any type of severe weather, whether it's a winter storm, a tropical system like a hurricane or a tropical storm, wind events. So, during hurricane season, June 1st to November 30th, we pay very, very close attention to the tropics. And, we're monitoring them every day. We're on the phone twice a day with the National Weather Service. And when there's a system that could impact New York City, we're also on the phone with the National Hurricane Center at least once a day, getting updates on the latest forecast, what the chances are to New York City, and then based on the forecast, deciding whether or not to activate our city's coastal storm plan.
The coastal storm plan is, I don't know, I'm tempted to call it complex. Maybe you can simplify it for our audience. That's the thing about regions. If you're in Region A, Region B, am I correct? Or?
Sure. So the city has 6 coastal storm evacuation zones, zones 1 through 6. And it gives us the ability, based on the size and scale of the storm and also the direction of the storm's approach, it gives us flexibility in terms of how many New Yorkers we need to evacuate when a storm's coming. Right. But evacuation is really only part of the services that the city is going to provide during a storm. A critical part, nonetheless, but there's a tremendous number of task forces and services that need to get stood up, ahead of and following a coastal storm, not just to support the evacuation, but also to support the sheltering operation, and then as the storm moves through, to go through debris removal, power restoration, damage assessment, dealing with things like temporary housing of people who are displaced. So the evacuation is just the start. Ahead of a coastal storm, we start a 120-hour timeline. And we have decision points that we need to make throughout that timeline on things like evacuation, on things like standing up the city's emergency supply stockpile, so that we're ready for evacuees if we ever have to issue an evacuation order again.
The violence of the storm, Sandy, is an example of what the scientists say climate change did to us and is going to do to us in the future, the effects of climate change. And I was interested specifically in the recommendations, or at least the findings of the climate change panel. New York City has a climate change panel. I'm sure you're aware of their recommendations or their findings. And in 2015, the climate change panel looked ahead to the 2050s and said that we're going to experience average yearly temperatures rising from 4 to almost 6 degrees. We're going to experience heavier precipitation and more severe storms like Sandy. And we're going to experience a sea level rise of 11 to 21 inches by the 2050s, and a lot of people think that's conservative. Are we prepared to deal with this kind of these effects?
We're preparing. You know, the results of the climate change panel and what we talk to other scientists and the National Weather Service about is not lost on anybody. And the city's Office of Recovery and Resiliency has a number of long-term projects to prepare the city for the effects of climate change and sea level rise. In emergency management, we're consequence managers, and we have plans for severe weather, we have plans for hurricanes and coastal storms, we have plans for severe heat, and we evaluate these plans on a regular basis to make sure that we're ready to respond to the needs of New Yorkers during all these events, and we'll continue to do that.
I think, as you point out, the city is preparing, and from the mayor's office, I heard comments on the subject that we're preparing for. We're looking to the 2050s, to about 2050. And then they expect the future administrations to plan beyond that. But in planning for the next 33 years, 34 years, I wonder how difficult or maybe even challenging your job becomes when we look at what the climate change people call the floodplain of New York. And by the 2050s, and even now, in the floodplain sit many of the major developments of this city: the World Trade Center, the Hudson Yards development on the west side, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the condos, all those great-looking condos in Long Island City and Williamsburg, Cornell's tech campus on Roosevelt Island, the new Whitney Museum. All of those things are in the floodplain now. If Sandy hits tomorrow, all those things are underwater. We can't move them. What do we do?
So what we do is mitigation. And the city's received a lot of money post-Sandy from the federal government, and certainly some local investment on mitigating against future flooding events and future disasters. And that's what the mayor's office is working through, and on the consequence side, it's what we're preparing for.
Well, define or describe mitigation, and what would it amount to? Our mitigation experts have lots of recommendations from, seawalls and the New York Rising program, elevating structures to make sure they're more susceptible to sea level rise and storm surge inundation. But there's a lot of complex engineering going into the city's mitigation efforts. So mitigation is what you're dealing with at the moment. Among the things we have seen that I guess qualify as mitigation was, taking emergency equipment in buildings, instead of having it on the ground floor, putting it up top. In coastal areas, I think the Bloomberg administration had a Build It Back program where even now in Broad Channel and places like that, the streets are being raised.
Right, as are some of the houses.
And the houses are being raised. So is all of this comprise mitigation?
It does.
And do we, when we see that after hurricanes, beaches are, whether they're here or North Carolina or wherever, they're wiped out, and then we build them back. The federal government pumps sand and builds. I mean, it seems like we're ignoring the obvious that it's just not going to last. From an emergency management point of view, does raising streets and raising buildings help a great deal, or is it just a temporary finger in the dike? You should pardon the analogy.
No, listen. With all of these programs, many of which are federally funded, they go through a benefit cost analysis to make sure that the money being spent is worthwhile. So, yes, we believe in these changes.
I was noting an interesting statistic from the MTA that on a dry day, a normal day, the MTA pumps 13 million gallons of groundwater out of the subway system. So when we get a storm and we get a flood, and it doesn't even have to be as bad as Sandy, we see the effects of how this city can be crippled. And I wonder, in terms of mitigation, what the city needs. I mean, the lifeblood of the city is the subway system, transit system. How do we keep that running? How do we keep that going in the 20, 30 years ahead when the climate change panel is talking about very severe consequences in the city?
So, I think some of it is mitigation engineering, and others are really more on the emergency management side, which is developing consequence management plans. Something the city has today, and we've had for a number of years now, is a flash flood emergency plan. So whenever the Weather Service is forecasting flash flooding rains, city agencies go out and take steps to prepare their infrastructure, clean catch basins, make sure the sewer systems in flood-prone areas are working to make sure the system's able to handle that increase in rainfall. We'll continue to build plans like that.
Does OEM and does your office in particular get involved in terms of contributing ideas up front, or are you dealing with the effects of things once they happen?
No, there's 4 parts to emergency management: preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery, and we have involvement in all 4 of those aspects. We do have a mitigation unit that's working all the time in collaboration with the mayor's office, with the federal government, with other city agencies on the city's mitigation plan and mitigation strategies. And so we're part of every cycle, every part of the emergency management cycle.
I read about a fascinating program, and I'm wondering if you can update us on it. I don't know if it has a name, but the city has gotten into these stackable apartment pods that would function as temporary housing, and they're really sleek and interesting looking buildings. But I understand it was a pilot program. It'd be they'd provide the kind of housing that emergency housing if a Sandy came along and people needed housing. So now we have these stackable pods. Where are we with that?
So it's a pilot program that we worked on with the Army Corps of Engineers, a number of agency partners, and FEMA. It's what we call our Interim Disaster Housing Unit. And you're right, it's stackable modular housing that can be deployed in an urban environment. This is a national problem for urban centers that we were trying to find a local solution for. Unlike other parts of the country, urban environments can't support like FEMA trailers. There's not wide open space where you can put FEMA disaster trailers. And so this is something that we've tried, and we've shared our results with the federal government, and those conversations are ongoing about how we would operationalize that plan.
So how many of these do we have at the moment? And I mean, again, recognizing this is just a pilot, but nonetheless, how many do we have?
Well, it was a pilot program to test the ability to build them, and the livability of them. So actually, over the last couple of years, some emergency management staff have actually stayed in there for several days at a time to test it out. My wife and I also stayed there. And when we answered some survey questions, with an academic institution that is doing some results for us. And it worked very well. We have to figure out how to operationalize it.
And that means what? Get the money to have more of these built, and
certainly more of these built. What do you need to do to clear the land to put them? Is it going to be city funded? Is FEMA going to stockpile them and use this for other urban areas beyond New York City? So those conversations are ongoing with our federal and state partners.
Much of what you do and you've described it is alert New Yorkers, keep them aware of what's going on. How would you like to see New Yorkers be prepared even now before they need to hear from you guys that something is going on? I mean, I understand you guys recommend all of us have a go bag. What's a go bag and what should be in it?
So a go bag is a great way for every individual and family to be prepared. What you want to put in there is some non-perishable food, flashlights, a battery-operated radio because the power grid might be down, but AM, FM radio is likely still going to work. A list of your medications if you're on any medications, some of those medications, some cash in case you can't use ATMs. And you want to hang that on your door or keep it in your car so that when an emergency happens, you'll have the resources you need with you to be able to be self-sufficient for several days.
And do you find New Yorkers paying attention to this? Are you having success getting people to prepare like this?
We are. Our Ready New York program, which is our public education campaign, does more than 1,000 presentations every year, reaching tens of thousands of New Yorkers. Kind of preaching the preparedness message.
Is this Ready Girl?
Ready Girl is a big part of that. Our new superhero. She goes and really focuses on childhood preparedness on schools, and was actually at Comic-Con a few weeks ago. In full costume. It's just another way to get the next generation involved in emergency preparedness.
Well, Ben, it's good to have you here, and as I said before, I hope we don't have to see each other under trying conditions. But thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and we'll see you next time.